The morning of the auction, there were 19 sheep nobody wanted. They were a sorry-looking lot, huddled in a back pen slick with mud and neglect, their wool thin and ragged like old blankets left out in the rain. They were the leftovers, the culls, the runts of several different flocks, swept together into a single offering of last resort. Their ribs showed like the teeth of a comb through their patchy fleece, and their eyes, when they bothered to lift their heads, were dull with a deep, settled misery. The auctioneer, a man whose voice was usually a booming tide of enthusiasm, barely gave them a glance, his patter for them as thin as their coats. He called them a project and a starter flock for the ambitious, which was auctioneer-speak for a collection of future losses. The local farmers, men with hands like worn leather and faces mapped by sun and worry, leaned against the rails, their arms crossed. They looked at the pen the way a man looks at a leaky roof in a coming storm. A problem he's glad isn't his. One of them, a big, prosperous man named Jed Miller, whose herds were the pride of the county, let out a short, barking laugh. He nudged his neighbor and said, loud enough for half the yard to hear, that he was looking at 19 funerals in a wool coat. It was then that she moved. Clara had been standing at the back, almost invisible in her plain coat, having slipped into the auction yard so quietly she seemed to have materialized from the morning mist. She hadn't gone to the pens with the prize bulls or the fat, promising heifers. She had walked directly to this forgotten corner, to the pen of rejects, and had been watching them for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable. She wasn't inspecting them for signs of life or potential, not in the way a farmer does. She was just watching, her gaze calm and steady, as if she were learning a language only they could speak. Now, as the auctioneer was about to dismiss the lot with a wave of his hand and move on to something worth his time, she raised her bidding number. It was a slight, almost hesitant gesture, but in the charged stillness around the pen, it was as loud as a gunshot. A murmur went through the crowd. The auctioneer squinted, surprised. He asked for an opening bid, a number so low it was an insult, and Clara nodded. He asked for another. Silence. He looked around the yard, his eyebrows raised in a theatrical plea. Jed Miller chuckled again, a low rumble in his chest. Let the girl have her hobby, he called out, and the men around him grinned. The gavel fell with a flat, indifferent crack. For the price of a decent dinner in the city she had just left, Clara had bought 19 problems. She had bought what everyone else saw as worthless. As she walked to the clerk's office to pay, the sound of muffled laughter followed her like a shadow. Jed Miller, shaking his head with a look of profound pity, made his final pronouncement to his audience. She's just bought herself a long, hard lesson, he said, his voice full of the certainty of a man who had never been wrong about such things. That land of her grandfather's will swallow that little bit of money, and those sheep and her with it. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of story, one about the quiet underdog and the wisdom that gets forgotten, I'd be grateful if you tap the like button. It tells the great algorithms of the world that there's still a place for patience. And if you have a moment, leave a comment telling me the name of the town or city you're watching from. I read every single one, and I like knowing where these stories travel, where they find a home. It feels like plotting points on a map of kindred spirits. The farm she had come home to was a place that had been breathing on its own for too long. It was her grandfather's land, then briefly her father's, and now through a series of quiet tragedies and legal papers, it was hers. She had returned not in triumph, but in a retreat so complete it felt like a surrender. The city had chewed her up and spit her out, not in some dramatic conflagration, but in a slow, grinding erosion of spirit and savings. She had worked a respectable, quiet job in a library, surrounded by the hushed rustle of pages. But the silence there was different. It was the silence of a vacuum, while the silence of the country she'd fled was the silence of a held breath, full of things unseen and unheard. A letter about her father's failing health had been the reason for her return, but by the time she had packed her small life into boxes, he was gone, and the farm had become her burden and her only refuge. It sat on a back road, 150 acres of memory and neglect. The house, a sturdy two-story testament to her great-grandfather's pragmatism, was sound, but the porch sagged with a weary sigh. The barn, once the proud heart of the operation, leaned just enough to make you nervous. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The pastures were the worst of it. They hadn't been grazed or hayed in years, and were choked with thistle and burdock, the good grasses crowded out by opportunistic weeds. The fences were little more than suggestions, their wires rusted and broken, the posts leaning at drunken angles. The place felt tired. The neighbors, including Jed Miller, had been kind in that pitying, country way. They'd offered to buy the place to take the burden off her hands. They saw the overgrown fields and the leaning barn, and saw only liability, a slow slide into decay. It was the sensible thing to do. Sell it, take the money, and start a new, smaller life somewhere else. For the first few weeks, that was her plan. She walked the property with a clipboard, making lists of liabilities, trying to see it as a realtor would. But something strange happened on those walks. The further she walked from the city's logic, the more a different kind of sense began to settle in her. She stood on the high ridge at the back of the property, looking down at the patchwork of fields and the winding creek, and felt not the weight of a burden, but the pull of an anchor. The wind in the tall, untamed grass didn't sound like loss. It sounded like patience. Something in her, a tightly wound spring of anxiety that had been her constant companion in the city, began to uncoil. She put the clipboard away. She wasn't going to sell. She was going to stay. She didn't have a plan. She had only a small inheritance, a profound sense of failure, and a deep, unexplainable need to understand the ground beneath her feet. Her first weeks with the sheep were a quiet, desperate education. She put them in the most secure of the decrepit pastures, a small field behind the barn, and spent her days shoring up the fences with salvaged wire and new posts she bought with what little money she had left. The animals were as lost as she was. They huddled together, wary and skittish, their health as fragile as spun glass. Two of them, the weakest of the lot, didn't make it through the first week. She buried them under the old oak tree on the hill, the work grim and sobering. Jed Miller's prediction of 19 funerals felt heavy in the air. The community watched her with a kind of morbid curiosity. They saw her truck, an aging, rust-pocked Ford, parked at the feed store, where she bought sacks of the cheapest grain and minerals, her face smudged with dirt. They saw her out in the fields from dawn until dusk, a small, solitary figure engaged in what looked like a fool's errand. She didn't have a tractor. She didn't have a crew. She had a pair of leather gloves, a post-hole digger, and a stubbornness that baffled them. Her decision to stay was one thing. Her decision to pour what little she had into a flock of dying sheep was another entirely. It was, in the local parlance, like trying to fill a sieve with water. It wasn't just impractical. It was an affront to the hard-won, debt-leveraged logic that governed modern farming. It felt personal to them, a judgment on their way of life, even though she never spoke a word of it. They couldn't understand that she wasn't trying to build a business. She was trying to listen to something she had forgotten how to hear. The search began out of desperation. The grain was keeping the sheep alive, but just barely. They weren't thriving. They were ghosts haunting a field. Clara knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the answer wasn't in another bag of feed. The answer was in the land itself, but it was a language she couldn't read. She started looking through the house, not for money or valuables, but for a key, a map, some record of how her grandfather, Thomas, had made this very land sing. He had been a legend in his time, a man who farmed with an almost mystical success. But his methods had been dismissed as old-fashioned by the time her own father took over, in favor of bigger machines and chemical fertilizers. In the attic, under a thick blanket of dust that smelled of time itself, she found it. A heavy, sea-worn wooden trunk, unlocked. Inside, nestled among old photographs and yellowed newspapers, were the notebooks. There were dozens of them, simple black-covered ledgers, filled from cover to cover with her grandfather's elegant, looping script. They were not farm logs. They were not simple records of profit and loss. They were journals, field notes, decades of patient, meticulous observation. He wrote about the weather not as an obstacle, but as a partner. He sketched the patterns of bird migrations, noting which seeds they ate and which they dropped. He had pages dedicated to the life cycle of the dung beetle and the way the earthworms moved after a rain. He wrote about the soil as if it were a living creature with moods and memories. He described the way the south-facing slope held the morning sun and how a particular strain of clover would pull nitrogen from the air and fix it in the ground, a free and patient fertilizer. The notebooks read like the private diary of a man deeply in love, a man studying the object of his affection not to exploit it, but to understand its deepest nature. Clara spent nights at the kitchen table, a single lamp burning, reading until her eyes burned, the world of the farm outside her window dissolving and reforming through her grandfather's eyes. She found a phrase, underlined again and again, in different years, in different contexts. The ground remembers. He wrote it after a drought, noting how the pastures with the deepest roots and the most organic matter bounced back the quickest. He wrote it after a flood, observing how the untilled fields absorbed the water, while the plowed ones shed it like a sheet of tin, taking the topsoil with it. He wrote it in reference to the animals, arguing that a flock raised on a piece of land for generations developed a unique resilience, a kind of localized wisdom passed down in their blood. The ground remembers what grew there. The ground remembers the tread of the animals that grazed it. The ground remembers the kindness or the cruelty of the hand that tends it. This became her compass. But it was all philosophical, a grand theory. She needed a starting point, a practical first step. The notebooks were full of wisdom, but it was like being given a library when all you needed was a single sentence. There was one person left who might be able to translate the philosophy into action, one living link to her grandfather's time, her great-aunt Elspeth. She was her grandfather's younger sister, a woman in her late 80s who lived in a small, tidy house in the next town over. Elspeth was as spare and practical as a well-honed tool. She wore her husband's old flannel shirts and work boots, and her words were rationed as if she had a finite supply. Clara drove to see her one afternoon, one of the notebooks resting on the passenger seat like a sacred text. She found her great-aunt in the garden, methodically weeding her tomato plants. Clara explained her situation, the farm, the sheep, the feeling of being utterly lost. She opened the notebook and showed her the underlined phrase. "The ground remembers," she read aloud. Elspeth listened without expression, her hands never ceasing their work. When Clara was finished, the old woman finally looked up, her eyes a pale, clear blue that missed nothing. She looked at Clara, then at the notebook, and then back at Clara. "Thomas was a fool for poetry," she said, her voice dry as dust. "But he wasn't wrong." She stood up, wiping her earthy hands on her trousers. "He wasted a lot of ink. It's simpler than all that." She squinted at Clara. "You bought the culls from the auction, didn't you? Heard about that at the post office." Clara nodded, bracing for the same gentle ridicule she got everywhere else. But Elspeth's face was unreadable. "Good," she said. "That's the first part. Thomas always said the strong ones are fools. They've never been tested. They break easy. The ones that have had to fight for it, the ones that survive being last, they've got a different kind of strength. They know how to live on less." She paused and delivered the final, crucial piece of advice. "You saw them in the pen. You watched them. Did you notice the ones that stood in the middle? Not the pushy ones at the trough, not the ones hiding in the corner. The ones that just held their place, quiet, in the center of the misery. Those are the ones. They know how to weather a storm. Your grandfather knew that. The rest is just dirt and water and time." It was not a grand pronouncement. It was a simple, practical observation. But for Clara, it was the key that unlocked the entire library. She had, by sheer dumb instinct, chosen the flock her grandfather would have chosen. She had seen what he would have seen. Not weakness, but a quiet, tested resilience. With Elspeth's words echoing in her mind, Clara's work took on a new focus. It was no longer a desperate scramble for survival, but a slow, deliberate implementation of a forgotten plan. The work was methodical and, to an outside eye, completely unremarkable. It was mostly invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. She began by dividing the largest pasture into smaller paddocks, using temporary electric fencing she bought with the last of her inheritance. It was a spiderweb of wires and plastic posts, a flimsy-looking setup that drew more than one chuckle from the road. But the notebooks were clear. Let the land rest. It does its best work when it's left alone. So she began to move the sheep every few days. She let them graze a small section down, but not to the bare earth, then moved them to the next, leaving the grazed paddock to recover. This rotational grazing was the core of her grandfather's system. It was a dance between the animals and the grass. The sheep, with their sharp hooves, broke up the soil crust, and their manure became a natural, slow-release fertilizer. The grazed grass, its top growth sheared off, was shocked into sending its roots deeper, seeking moisture and nutrients. And the long rest period allowed the good native grasses, the ones the ground remembered, to outcompete the thistles and weeds. It was a process that couldn't be rushed. It required more walking, more work, more daily attention than simply turning a herd out into a 100-acre field and letting them be. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the flock. Mornings were for moving the fence, checking the water trough she had to fill by hand from a well near the barn, and spending a long time just watching the sheep. She learned their individual personalities. She saw the leaders, the followers, the solitary ones. She saw, just as Elspeth had described, the quiet ones who held the center, who seemed to carry an innate sense of calm that settled the whole flock. Afternoons were for the larger projects, clearing brush from fence lines by hand, not with a machine, but with a billhook and a scythe, her movements slow and rhythmic. She repaired the old stone walls that bordered the property, lifting each heavy stone back into place, feeling the satisfying heft of it settling home. She was not fighting the land, trying to beat it into submission. She was tending it, coaxing it, listening to what it wanted to do, and helping it along. There was no dramatic transformation. From the road, the farm still looked shaggy and unkempt. The change was happening at a level most people didn't know how to see, in the soil. After a few months, if you knelt down and dug your fingers into the earth of a rested pasture, you'd find it was no longer dry and compacted. It was dark, crumbly, and teeming with worms. It smelled rich and alive. Clara would often do just that, holding a handful of the soil, feeling its cool, damp life, and she would write her own observations in a new notebook, its pages filling with her own looping script, a continuation of the conversation her grandfather had started 60 years before. The county's true circulatory system for news and opinion was not the local paper, it was the feed store. Elias Pratt's supply was a long, low building that smelled of grain dust, leather, and machine oil. It was where debt was discussed, weather was cursed, and reputations were made or broken over a cup of weak, hot coffee. Clara was a frequent topic of conversation. Her project, as they called it, had become a kind of local folklore, a running joke with a new chapter every week. Jed Miller was the primary narrator of this tale. He held court near the front counter, a large man whose success gave his opinions the weight of gospel. He never spoke with malice. It was worse than that. He spoke with a kind of paternalistic, sorrowful concern that was far more cutting. "Saw her out there with that string fence again this morning," he'd say, shaking his head slowly, "chasing those poor creatures from one patch of weeds to another. It's a shame, a real shame. A girl like that ought to be in town somewhere." His lieutenants, other successful farmers who orbited him like moons, would nod in solemn agreement. They saw her methods as a kind of heresy. They farmed with size and force. They had massive air-conditioned tractors that cost more than her entire farm was worth. They sprayed for weeds, fertilized with chemicals delivered in giant tankers, and bought their stock based on genetic markers and performance data printed on a sheet. Her work with a scythe and a handful of notebooks was a regression, an absurdity. When Clara came in for supplies, a hush would fall over the group. Jed would often greet her with false friendliness, his voice booming through the store. "Clara, how are those prize-winning sheep of yours doing?" he'd ask, a twinkle in his eye that everyone understood. The other men would study their boots, trying to suppress their smiles. The first few times the question had flustered her. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sting of being the outsider, the failure. But then she remembered her grandfather's calm, observant prose, and Elspeth's unshakable pragmatism. She learned to meet his gaze directly, her own expression unreadable. "They're doing all right," she would say, her voice flat and even. "Getting stronger." There was no defensiveness, no anger, no attempt to justify herself. She would simply state the fact as she saw it. Her level, non-reactive tone was a bucket of cold water on their fun. It left them in an awkward silence, the joke falling flat. Jed would clear his throat, suddenly finding something on a high shelf intensely interesting. Her refusal to be baited, her quiet confidence, was more perplexing to them than anything else. She wasn't arguing. She was just working. Not everyone participated in the gentle mockery. The store's owner, Elias Pratt, was a man as old and weathered as the building he inhabited. He was a fixture, a man who had seen generations of farmers come and go, who had extended credit on a handshake and seen fortunes rise and fall with the price of corn. He rarely spoke, preferring to observe from behind his counter, his eyes missing nothing. He watched the exchanges between Clara and Jed Miller's circle, his face impassive. He saw the way she never rose to the bait. He saw the calluses on her hands when she counted out her cash. He saw the specific blend of minerals she was buying, a custom mix he hadn't sold in 30 years, not since her grandfather was a customer. One afternoon, after Clara had made her purchase and left, and the usual round of chuckles had subsided, Elias spoke, his voice raspy from disuse. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "her grandfather Thomas used to do the same thing. Moved his cows every day. All the boys with the new tractors laughed at him too." He paused, polishing a smudge on the glass counter with his thumb. "They laughed right up until the drought of '88. He was the only man in this county who had hay to sell. Sold it to the same men who'd been laughing." He didn't look at Jed Miller. He didn't need to. The statement hung in the dusty air, a small, hard stone of truth dropped into a pond of easy opinion. It didn't change anyone's mind, not then, but it was the first crack in the wall of consensus. Later that week, when Clara came in, Illis bagged her feed and then added a small, heavy sack of something else. "On the house," he said before she could protest. "It's a mix of deep-root clover and chicory. Thomas used to overseed with it in the fall. Said it was good for the dry times." It was not just a gift, it was a confirmation. It was the first external sign that she was not crazy, that the path she was on was a real one, a path someone else had walked before. That night she walked out into the pasture as the sun was setting and cast the seeds by hand, the way her grandfather would have, the small grains rattling against the plastic bucket in a rhythm of quiet hope. She felt for the first time since returning that she was not alone. The first tangible success was not a dramatic event, but a series of quiet observations she recorded in her notebook. She wrote them down without ceremony, but she allowed herself to sit with the feeling, the slow, warm bloom of satisfaction. It began with the wool. One morning while checking the flock, she ran her hand over the back of one of the ewes, one of the quiet ones from the center of the pen. The fleece, which had been thin and brittle, was now thick and dense, with a greasy, healthy lanolin feel to it. It was springing back from her touch. She checked another and another. It was the same across the flock. The steady diet of diverse, nutrient-rich forage was doing what no amount of grain could. Their bodies were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to build reserves. Then came the lambs. She had worried the ewes were too weak to breed, or that their lambs would be born sickly. But one cool spring morning, she found 3 of them, tucked against their mothers, small and shaky but fiercely alive. They were not big, but they were sturdy, and within an hour they were up and nursing with a vigor that brought a lump to her throat. Over the next few weeks, more lambs arrived. She ended the season with 16 new lives, a near-perfect lambing rate from a flock that had been written off as barren. The sheep themselves were transformed. Their eyes were bright and clear, their movements no longer skittish but calm and deliberate. They moved through the pastures not as a panicked mob, but as a cohesive unit, a true flock. They were, in a word, content. She sat on the porch one evening, watching them graze in the fading light, the lambs bouncing and playing, and felt a profound sense of peace. The land was healing, and the animals were healing with it. And in the process, something in her was healing too. The constant gnawing feeling of failure that had followed her from the city had been replaced by the quiet confidence of competence. She wasn't just tending sheep, she was cultivating resilience in the soil, in the animals, and in herself. The first sales happened almost by accident. She had no intention of building a brand or marketing a product. Her focus was entirely on the health of the land and the flock. Elias Pratt was her first customer. He had come out to the farm one day on the pretense of checking on an old fence post order, but his eyes were on the sheep. He watched them for a long time, chewing on a piece of hay. "They look good, Clara," he said, his highest form of praise. "They look like your grandfather's sheep used to look." A few weeks later, he asked if she would consider selling him a couple of the older lambs for his own freezer. He was tired, he said, of meat that tasted of corn and confinement. He wanted something that tasted of grass and sunshine. Clara agreed, and a few days later, Elias handed her a check that was significantly more than the going rate. "That's what it's worth," he said, cutting off her protest. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you different." Word began to spread, not through advertisements, but through conversations over dinner tables. Elias shared the meat with his son's family. His son mentioned it to a friend. Someone at church asked where the Pratts had gotten lamb that tasted so different. The flavor was complex and clean, with a hint of the wild herbs they foraged in the pastures. It didn't taste like modern commodity meat. It tasted of a place. It tasted of the land her grandfather had loved. People started calling her, tentatively at first, a teacher from the local school, a doctor from the clinic in the next town. They had heard about the burnt fork sheep, a name that had emerged organically from the creek that ran through her property. She had no sign at the end of her lane, no website, no business cards. The enterprise, if it could be called that, grew by quiet reputation. Each sale was a small victory, not for the money, but for the validation. Each person who tasted the difference was another person who understood, on a visceral level, what she was doing. They were tasting the rested pastures, the deep-rooted clover, the patient rotation. They were tasting the memory of the ground. Then came the crisis. It started in late spring, with a sky that was too blue, too often. The usual thunder showers that greened up the county never arrived. June was dry, July was brutal. The sun beat down with a relentless, punishing heat. The creeks shrank, their songs fading to a whisper, then to a cracked, muddy silence. The grass in the vast, single-crop fields of her neighbors turned a sickly yellow, then a brittle, uniform brown. The land began to look scorched, as if a low-burning fire had swept across it. The radio started calling it the worst drought in living memory. Dust, the fine, precious topsoil of the county, began to lift from the plowed fields, blowing in great, hazy clouds that turned the sunsets a terrifying, apocalyptic red. For the farmers who had built their operations on the assumption of rain and the power of credit, it was a catastrophe. Their corn withered on the stalk. Their hayfields produced nothing. They were forced to haul in water at ruinous expense and buy feed they couldn't afford. The auction yard where Clara had bought her sheep became a place of grim desperation. The pens were now filled with prime cattle, good breeding stock that men like Jed Miller were forced to sell off at a fraction of their value. They were selling their futures to survive the present. The laughter was gone from the auction yard. It was replaced by the tight, grim faces of men watching their life's work evaporate into the dusty air. They were trapped. Their heavy machinery sat idle. Their chemical solutions were useless against a clear blue sky. Their entire system, so powerful and impressive in a good year, was as fragile as a house of cards in a high wind. It was built on force, and they were facing a force they could not command. And then there was Clara's farm. In the midst of the brown, desiccated landscape, her 150 acres were an island of impossible green. It was not the lush, uniform green of an irrigated golf course. It was a mosaic of different shades, from the dark green of the chicory to the paler green of the native grasses. But it was vibrantly, stubbornly alive. People started to notice. They would slow their cars as they drove past on the county road, staring in disbelief. The sight was so jarring, so contrary to the reality of everything around it, that it felt like a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle. It was the result of 3 years of quiet, invisible work. It was the payoff for every rested pasture, every handful of clover seed, every stone reset in the wall. The soil on her farm, rich with organic matter and riddled with the deep channels of earthworms and plant roots, had become a sponge. It had soaked up the meager spring rains and held them deep within itself, rationing the moisture back to the plants through the long, dry summer. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. The ground remembers. Her ground remembered rain. Her rotational grazing system, which had seemed so inefficient and fussy, was now her salvation. The sheep had plenty to eat. Her well, fed by the slow percolating groundwater held in the living soil, had not run dry. While her neighbors were selling off their animals, hers were thriving, the lambs growing fat and strong on the diverse forage. The vindication was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, visual, and absolute. It was the color green in a brown county. It was the sight of healthy animals on healthy land. She didn't have to say a word. The farm spoke for her. The skeptics, the men who had laughed, now drove past her land slowly, their faces a mixture of awe and a dawning, terrible understanding. They were not just looking at a successful pasture. They were looking at the stark, undeniable evidence of a different kind of wisdom, a wisdom they had dismissed as foolishness, and they were beginning to understand the price of their laughter. One evening in the deepest part of the drought, a familiar truck rumbled slowly up her long lane. It was Jed Miller. He parked by the barn and got out, not with his usual booming confidence, but with the hesitant movements of a man entering a church. He had his hat in his hand. Clara watched him approach from the porch steps, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know what to expect. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze not on her, but on the pasture behind the house, where her flock was calmly grazing on green grass. He looked at the sheep, then at the deep, healthy turf under their feet. He looked at the line where her property met his, a stark, brutal contrast between dusty brown and living green. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching out, filled only with the sound of the crickets who still had enough moisture to sing. Finally, he turned his eyes to her. They were not filled with anger or envy. They were filled with a profound, weary bewilderment, the look of a man whose compass has shattered in his hand. He cleared his throat. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out flat and hard, not as an apology or a compliment, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things. It was a confession, a simple statement of a fact that had become too large to ignore. He had built his entire life, his entire identity, on a set of principles that the weather had just proven false. He looked back at the field. "My grandfather," he said, his voice softer now, "he used to talk about some of this stuff. I thought he was just an old man, stuck in the past." He shook his head, a small defeated gesture. "I'm feeding my cattle hay I trucked in from 3 states away. I'm hauling water. I'm selling off 20 years of genetics for pennies on the dollar just to make payroll." He looked at her again, and for the first time, she saw not the proud, loud skeptic, but a man who was scared. "You," he said, "you're going to come out of this stronger than you went in." It was the plainest truth in the county, and hearing it from him, in that moment, was a victory more satisfying than any financial gain. He didn't just admit his error. He came to learn. The confession was only the beginning. A few days after his first visit, Jed Miller came back. This time he came not with a confession, but with a question. "How?" he asked. It was a single word, but it contained a universe of humbled curiosity. He wanted to understand the mechanics of the miracle. He was a practical man, and he needed to see the gears and levers. So Clara walked him through her farm. She didn't lecture or gloat. She simply showed him. She knelt down and had him plunge his hands into the soil of a rested pasture to feel the cool, damp life in it. She showed him the difference between that and the soil from a pasture the sheep had just left. She explained the simple logic of the rotation, the partnership between the animals and the grass. She took him to the creek bed and showed him how, even in the drought, a tiny trickle of water still seeped from the banks on her side, where the deep-rooted plants held the water table, while his side was bone dry. He listened, his usual boisterousness replaced by a quiet, intense focus. He asked sharp, intelligent questions. He was a good farmer, just one who had been taught only one way to farm. At the end of the tour, he made an offer. "I've got a 40-acre field up on the North Ridge," he said. "It's useless to me right now. It's just dust. I want you to take it on. Do what you do here. I'll pay for the fencing, the water line, whatever you need. I don't want to share the profit. I want to watch. I want you to teach me. It was an astonishing proposal. He was not just asking for advice, he was offering her his own land as a classroom and offering to pay for his own education. He wanted to buy her superior breeding stock, too, a few of her best ram lambs, and he offered a price that made her blink. He wanted to infuse his own flock. What was left of it, with the resilience he now saw, was more valuable than any pedigree. Jed Miller's conversion did what Clara's success alone could not. It gave the rest of the community permission to believe. Jed was the standard bearer for conventional wisdom. If he was admitting he was wrong, and not just admitting it, but actively trying to learn a new way, then it was no longer possible to dismiss Clara as a lucky eccentric. His capitulation was a signal. Other farmers started to visit. They came tentatively, often alone, their trucks pulling into her lane with the same hesitation Jed's had. They came with questions about the soil, about the grasses, about the sheep. They were men who had been farming one way their entire lives, who had inherited that way from their fathers, and who were now watching it fail. Clara became an unlikely teacher. She walked them through her fields, the same tour she had given Jed, her quiet explanations cutting through decades of established dogma. She shared pages from her grandfather's notebooks, letting his words speak for themselves. She didn't present it as a magic bullet, but as a different philosophy, one based on observation instead of intervention, on health instead of production, on patience instead of speed. She was sharing the knowledge freely, understanding that the health of her farm was ultimately tied to the health of the land around it. A single green island couldn't survive forever in a sea of dust. The whole ecosystem had to heal. It was the beginning of a slow, quiet revolution in the county, one that started not in a boardroom or a university lab, but in a woman's pasture, with a handful of dark, living soil. One afternoon, a new figure appeared at the edge of the field where she was working. It was a teenage boy from a neighboring farm, Leo. He was quiet and serious, known for being a hard worker. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood and watched her for the better part of an hour as she moved a section of the electric fence. Finally, he walked over. "My dad said I should come ask if you needed any help," he said, though it was clear the idea was his own. He was looking at the land, at the sheep, with an intuitive understanding that she recognized immediately. He had, as her grandfather might have written, the hands for it. Clara, whose own body was weary from the ceaseless labor, hired him on the spot. She paid him a fair wage out of her growing lamb sales and began to teach him everything she knew. He was a natural. He absorbed the knowledge not as a set of instructions, but as a way of seeing. He learned to read the land, to notice the subtle shifts in the pasture, to understand the behavior of the flock. He had a quiet patience that matched her own. He would spend hours just watching, learning the rhythms of the place. He was not just a hired hand, he was an apprentice. He was the next link in the chain. Seeing him work, seeing the way he instinctively understood the principles her grandfather had laid down, gave Clara a sense of hope that went beyond her own success. The knowledge would not die with her. It was being passed on, from her grandfather, through her to a new generation. The legacy was secure. It was growing, sending out new roots into the future. As the drought broke and the farm's reputation grew, demand for her lamb and wool skyrocketed. Restaurants from the city started calling. A high-end yarn company wanted to buy her entire wool clip for a premium. The temptation to expand was immense. The banks, which wouldn't have given her the time of day 3 years ago, were now sending representatives to her door, offering her loans, credit lines, expansion capital. It was the modern way. Leverage your success. Take on debt. Get bigger, faster. Jed Miller, now her most ardent student, even encouraged her. "You could have 500 head on this land in 2 years," he told her, his old instincts for scale dying hard. But Clara refused. She kept coming back to a page in her grandfather's last notebook. He had written it late in his life, his handwriting a bit shakier. "Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do," it read. "It is a promise made by a stranger, your present self, that a man you have not yet met, your future self, will have to keep. It chains the future to the present. But the land does not work that way. The land grows at its own pace. You cannot force a harvest. You can only nurture the conditions for it. Grow the way the land grows. Let demand pull you. Do not push yourself into a future you cannot predict. So she resisted the lure of rapid expansion. She grew her flock slowly, keeping only the best ewe lambs, letting the size of her operation be determined not by the demands of the market, but by the carrying capacity of her land. She let the waiting list for her products grow long. Her refusal to take on debt and scale up was, to the business world, as baffling as her initial purchase of the sheep. But it was the same principle, the same quiet, patient wisdom. She was building something not for quick profit, but for permanence. She was building it to last. Great Aunt Elspeth lived just long enough to see the full turning of the tide. Clara would visit her every few weeks, bringing her a small cut of lamb or just news from the farm. Elspeth never offered effusive praise. That wasn't her way, but she would listen, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. One afternoon, Clara told her about Jed Miller leasing her his field to be healed. Elspeth let out a dry little chuckle. Men, she said, as if that single word explained all the foolishness and eventual redemption in the world. They have to crash the car before they'll read the map. The last time Clara saw her, Elspeth was frail, confined to her chair by the window overlooking her garden. Clara told her about Leo, the young apprentice, and the way he seemed to understand the land without being told. Elspeth's eyes, still clear and sharp, lit up. "Good," she said, her voice a thin whisper. "The chain isn't broken." She reached out a bony, trembling hand and laid it on Clara's. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "He knew the land would wait for someone who was willing to listen." Elspeth passed away peacefully in her sleep a week later. Her death was a quiet sorrow for Clara, but it was not a tragedy. It felt like a completion. The last living link to her grandfather's generation was gone, but her final words had been the passing of a torch. With Elspeth's death, Clara felt the mantle of the wise elders settle, unexpectedly and lightly, onto her own shoulders. She was no longer just the keeper of the legacy. She was now its source. Years passed. The farm thrived. The creek ran clear and full year-round. The pastures were a lush, resilient tapestry of grasses and herbs. The flock, descended from those original 19 outcasts, was known throughout the region for its health and vigor. Clara's operation never got huge. It grew organically, finding its natural, sustainable size. Leo was no longer an apprentice, but a partner, his quiet competence a steadying presence. One spring afternoon, Clara found herself back at the same auction yard where her story had begun. She wasn't there to buy. She was there to sell, offering a few of her top-quality rams to other farmers who were now practicing her methods. She stood by the pen, watching the animals. They were calm and confident, their wool thick, their bodies strong. They were the genetic echo of the 19 survivors she had brought home years ago. A crowd of farmers had gathered, but this time, the atmosphere was different. Jed Miller was there, leaning against the rail, looking at the rams with an expert's eye. He caught Clara's gaze and gave her a slow, respectful nod. Other men who had once chuckled at her, now approached her with quiet questions, seeking her opinion on their own flocks, their own land. As the auctioneer started the bidding for her first ram, a hush fell over the yard. The opening bid was strong, and it climbed quickly, the numbers rising in a steady cadence of respect. No one laughed. No one whispered jokes. They were all looking at the same thing they had looked at years ago, livestock in a pen. But now they finally understood what they were seeing. They saw not just an animal, but a story. They saw the value in what had once been rejected. They saw the quiet power of patience and observation. The final ram sold for a price that made the old auctioneer whistle. As the crowd dispersed, Clara remained by the empty pen, the scent of hay and animals filling the air. She thought of her grandfather's looping script, of Elspeth's pragmatic wisdom, of the long, solitary hours of work that had felt less like labor and more like a conversation. She had come here as a failure, an outsider, and had found her purpose in a pen of rejects. She had discovered that the most valuable things are often the ones that are overlooked, that the rejected thing is the valuable thing if you only know how to read it, that patience beats money and attention beats force, that the ground remembers, and that true worth does not need to argue or shout. In the end, it simply proves itself, as quietly and as certainly as grass growing in a rested field. If this story meant something to you, if it resonated with some quiet, stubborn part of your own life, I'd ask you to share it with someone. Maybe share it with someone who, like those sheep, feels like they are not worth much, or maybe just someone who appreciates a story where the quiet ones win. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me about the thing in your own life that everybody laughed at, the small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway, because you knew somehow that it had a value nobody else could see. I read every comment, everyone. I will read yours.